My name is Jen, and I'm an addict. I've introduced myself this way thousands upon thousands of times over the past 12 or so years. I can assure you, though, that this particular time is going to stand out as the scariest time I've ever introduced myself this way. But my name is Jen, and I am an addict. I normally introduce myself this way in the basements of churches, where I meet with other people struggling with addiction in 12-step recovery meetings. Upstairs in the sanctuary, I'm Jen Carlier from the Netherlands, an active member of my local congregation, a youth group volunteer, a newly minted doctor, not the life-saving helpful kind, more the chatty kind, but still a doctor. And if you know me a little better, I'm Jen with a double N, with a somewhat quirky and dark sense of humor, a number 6 on the Enneagram, and thus prepared for every single way this talk could fall apart. I am many things up in the sanctuary, but what I am definitely not is an addict or someone who sometimes struggles with depression or someone who often feels like an imposter. Those are not my sanctuary-sanctioned identities. Those identities belong in the basement. I started my journey of recovery about 12 years ago, and when I went to rehab, I told the church that I was a part of at the time that I was going on a lengthy, silent spiritual retreat. The idea of telling the church that I was struggling with addiction, much less going to rehab, was simply unthinkable to me at the time. Addiction was just not one of those things we ever talked about, and no one I knew seemed to struggle with it. Church, after all, is where everyone shows up in their Sunday best, right? A subtle but clear hint about the kind of person you're supposed to be at church. When I finished rehab, I started going to these 12-step groups in the basements of churches. And these groups asked of me something that the churches I had been a part of up until then had never asked of me. They asked me to show up fully and completely as me. They asked for my vulnerability, and in response to my many failures, moments of deep shame, many relapses and slips, they kept offering back this unconditional acceptance and grace. And that gave me the courage to start walking towards recovery. And over time, I found these moments of reprieve from my addiction that felt like a kind of salvation to me. Salvation not just from the hell of addiction, which truly was a kind of hell, but also from the hell of hiding myself, of pretending to be happier and more put together and more successful, and of course, a whole lot straighter than I actually was and am. Of pretending to be who I thought my church and even God needed me to be in order to be loved and accepted. I found God in a different place than I was told to look. I did not find the God of love and grace in the sanctuary among the saints, but in the basement among the so-called sinners, with the drunks and junkies, with the tweakers and deviants. That's where I found God. And I have, of course, in the years since, also seen glimpses of this God in the sanctuary. But I'm indebted to these basement communities for my first introduction to that God. And so today, I want to focus on 3 things that those of us in the sanctuary can learn from those who meet in our basements. And the first is this: everyone, at different times, in different ways, is broken and in need of help. And I think in many ways we already know this in the church. A saying that's often attributed to 3rd century theologian St. Augustine, and sometimes also to his well-known contemporary Abbey of the Dear Abby columns, is this: the church is a hospital for sinners, not a museum for saints, right? The church is a hospital for sinners. And I think if you ask most people in churches, they would say that they agree with this statement, this sentiment in principle. The church is a hospital for sinners. Jesus, after all, said something very similar when the Pharisees asked why he spent so much time with tax collectors and sinners. Jesus said, "It isn't the healthy who need a doctor, it's the sick." But for a community that sees herself as a hospital for sinners, we do seem oddly surprised whenever someone in our midst, or God forbid the pastor, turns out to be an actual sinner. It seems that we want to be a community of healing for the broken without having to admit that any of us are in fact broken. Can you imagine a hospital full of patients pretending to be perfectly healthy? What a waste of a hospital. And yet, that's often what our sanctuaries look like. A hospital for sinners, chock full of people pretending to be perfectly fine. In the basement, no one is surprised when I introduce myself as an addict. That's why we exist. No one is horrified when someone with long-term sobriety says that they've slipped or relapsed. We know that's a possibility for any of us. In fact, everyone in the basement introduces themselves as an addict, right? It doesn't matter if you have 24 years of sobriety or just barely 24 hours. Everyone introduces themselves as an addict. This small practice of introducing ourselves this way is one way we remind ourselves that none of us, no matter how long we've been there, has arrived. That all of us, in different ways, at different times, are broken and in need of help. So if the first thing we can learn from the basement is that everyone is broken and in need of help, the second is that we are not alone. I came to the basement with a crushing amount of shame. There were things I had done and people that I had hurt that I never wanted anyone to know anything about. But slowly, over time, as people started sharing their stories, I started sharing some of the things that brought me shame. And the most interesting thing I discovered in these interactions is that I'm actually not all that interesting. It turns out that most of us are having a fairly average human experience, right? No matter what dark thoughts you might have, no matter what deep sexual deviance you might have, no matter what people you've hurt or things you've said, you're probably just having a pretty average experience. In the basement, we say, you're likely just another bozo on the bus. And I think we all know this in theory. But the problem is you can't actually learn it in theory. You can only experience it in practice. I knew I wasn't the first person to have done some of the things that I did in my addiction. I mean, the Google machine told me that much. But it wasn't until I shared some of those things and saw looks, smiles, nods, even laughs of recognition that I really believed it. Sharing your story in a community that values those stories as sacred, that can hold them without judgment, that's an experience of grace. Hearing your story reflected in the story of another, and therein finding freedom from isolation and shame, that's an experience of salvation. Sharing the most painful parts of yourself and seeing acceptance, grace, and even love on the faces of those listening. That's seeing God on the faces of your fellows. If the first thing we can learn from the basement is that we are all broken and in need of help, the second is that none of us are alone. The third is a little different. The third is vulnerability is an act of hospitality. It's not easy to be a hospital for sinners. It's not easy to be a place where people can show up as their full selves, brokenness and all. It's not easy to be a place where people share their lives with each other. And I think if we want to be that space in the sanctuary, then we are going to have to do some hard work. And our impulse might be to start a new program, maybe to create a Sunday school series around mental health or addiction, or maybe to talk about it from the pulpit. And those are all good impulses in and of themselves. But I think if we really want to be a hospital for sinners, we're going to have to do something far simpler and far more challenging than that. We're going to have to show up with our own brokenness and lead with our own vulnerability. When I went to one of those basement meetings for the first time, I was terrified. I had no idea what to expect. I was worried that I would be judged for being too messed up or maybe not messed up enough. I'd spent so long just trying to hold my life together, trying to make it look all right from the outside, that I had no idea how to even begin talking about the sheer unmanageability of it. And so I armored up, and I went into that room, and I sat down, and I looked at the carpet, and I hoped that no one would take notice of me. Thankfully, they did take notice of me. My discomfort gave it away. Everyone there knew that I was a newcomer. And having been in recovery a while themselves, they all knew that the thing that I most needed in that moment was to come out of isolation and to begin talking about what brought me to the basement. But they didn't ask me any questions, and thank God they didn't tell me to start sharing my story. Instead, they did the most generous thing. One by one, every single person there, all 20 of them, told the story of what brought them to the basement. They talked about the pain and shame of addiction. They talked about lying to spouses and disappointing children, of losing families and jobs and money and dignity. They talked about how hard it was for them to come to the basement for the first time. And they talked about how over time, through mutual sharing and support, these communities changed their lives. Every person there shared their life with me. And by sharing so much of themselves, they gave me the courage to put down my armor and to begin talking about what had brought me to the basement that day. Their vulnerability was an act of hospitality. Without it, I would never have begun sharing, and without that, I would not have started my journey of recovery. So if we want to be a hospital for sinners, we're going to have to lead with our vulnerability. See, I think often when we talk in the church, or when I talk in the church about wanting to create spaces for people to share their lives with each other, what I actually mean, and what we actually mean, is that I want to create space for other people to share. Right? I'm happy and even honored to listen to another person share their story. I just don't want to be the person sharing. And the problem, of course, is that we all feel this way. People don't like to share in spaces where that is not the norm. Right? This only works if we all participate. I'm comfortable sharing my brokenness in the basement because everyone shares their brokenness there. I'm not doing something that's out of the norm there. So how do you begin doing that in a space where that isn't baked into the culture in the way it is in the basement? Well, maybe the next time the person sitting next to you at church asks how you're doing, you could tell them how you're doing. And I know that's not the norm here. When I came here from the Netherlands, it took me about 3 weeks to figure out that, hey, how are you doing? Just does not mean what I think it does. It's just Southern for hello. And so I know this is countercultural, right? It's countercultural to answer that question truthfully. It almost borders on social faux pas. But maybe the church is supposed to be that countercultural. So maybe the next time the person sitting next to you asks how you're doing, you could risk telling them how you're doing and just see what happens. I can tell you from my own experience that the worst that will happen is that they just won't make the mistake of asking you that question again. They'll just say hello, like we do in the Netherlands. But I think sometimes they do want to know. And they also want to share with you how they're doing. In fact, I think more often than not, you'll find that people are longing to be seen and heard, and all they needed was for someone else to pave the way, was for someone else to open the door for them to make it possible for them to be vulnerable. Your vulnerability can be that act of hospitality for another. And maybe the next time you're in a Sunday school class or a Bible study or a small group or whatever it is you do at your church, you could risk being just a little more vulnerable. Or maybe the next time someone asks for prayer requests, instead of raising the news of the day, you could say what's going on with you. Small acts of vulnerability have the capacity to change the culture of a place. I've seen this happen in the basement, time and time again. Meetings change mid-course, right? All it takes is one person. As soon as one person risks being vulnerable, the door is open for everyone else to do the same, and they do. And I know it's a risk I'm asking you to take. Even now, years into this recovery journey, whenever a newcomer comes to the basement, I have this moment where I don't want to share my story because I don't know them and I'm not sure what they're going to do with that information. But then I remember my first meeting and those 20 people who risked vulnerability for me. And I find myself opening my mouth and saying, "My name is Jen, and I'm an addict. Thank you."